committed my besetting sin and forgot to pray opening day of class. I don't know why I was on the opening day of class, but today we will pray before we do anything else. So let's pray. Father in heaven, we honor you and acknowledge you as our creator, as the one who's given us everything that we have. You have all wisdom. You've made us in your image to govern on your behalf, and we've made such a mess of it. So we pray that as we study the political theology of the past, and especially today, Augustine, help us to learn from it, help us to understand it, help us to draw from it what is good and faithful to Christ, and to be able to discern what is not. And we pray that we would be able to learn well from each other as we do this. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so the way I want to approach this, and with the group this size and everything, I'll kind of adapt and see how things go. But you've all written out your theses and you have your questions, so everybody should have some formulated thoughts. But rather than just sort of a free-for-all and let, sort of a undirected way of thinking through this stuff, what I want to do is kind of walk through book by book the readings from the City of God to make sure we understand Augustine's argument. And then you'll notice that a lot of the other things that you had to read on the different topics, they're really an application of the foundation that's been laid in the City of God. So I want to leave them towards the end. So think of it as, the first half, we're trying to make sure we understand what's the real argument of the City of God, what's the sort of the foundational theology that Augustine's trying to articulate. And then we can talk about what are some of the implications of that. So as we go through book by book, I'll ask, who of you has written like a thesis on this book, on what we're talking about here, and maybe ask you to read that, or a question or something like that. And that can be part of the discussion. It doesn't mean you're bound to only speak up if you've written a thesis on it or something, and I might direct us in certain ways to move us along, but that's kind of how I want to try it. And then when I feel like we've got the key argument of a certain book, then we'll move on to the next one and see how it goes. And then I plan on leaving approximately 25 to 30 minutes at the end to set up next week's topic. So starting with book 2, and of course I said a little bit to set up Augustine and the background of the City of God last week, so I won't do that again. But if you were paying attention to the lecture, book 2 really it shows more than any other kind of the purpose that led Augustine to write this. So let me make sure I remember the exact chapters I told you to read from it. 19, 20. Okay, so just remind me, or remind us all, what is the charge against Christians that Augustine is engaging here in the City of God? What's the accusation?
They're the reason why the country is basically falling apart.
Yeah. So the big question then is how does Augustine respond to that charge? So did anybody write a thesis or question pertaining to that part, book 2, chapters 19 to 21, which is pages 16 through 21. Yeah, Leah,
You want my thesis statement or just the response?
If you wrote it on this.
Yeah. Augustine argues that the moral ruin of Rome, revealed in luxury, greed, pride, and loss of justice, was the cause of its decline, contesting the Roman tendency to make Christianity its scapegoat to blame for problems and misfortunes. For Augustine, good virtue and the pursuit of justice go hand in hand to ensure the moral prosperity of the city. So he blamed their luxury, greed, etc.
Okay, so you think he's basically turning it around on them and saying, no, it's your immorality? So can you point to a spot in the text where he says that?
So I was thinking, specifically the luxury, greed, pride, loss of justice was on page 16 instead of this copy of it. So just saying, like, it's not about Christianity, think about your own character and your own morals and how that's contributed. Instead of just pointing to other people or groups of people, is how I understood it.
Okay, so yeah, you look at the Roman Republic, which, quote, having changed little by little from the most beautiful and best, has become the worst and most disgraceful. Right, then he says, I'm not saying that, their author said that, and they said it before Jesus was even born. But does that mean he's saying that's why Rome went into decline? Does he actually say that? He's doing something more subtle here. He's not committing the same fallacy they did, I don't think.
I don't know if this is what you're talking about, but he makes this argument that the Republic actually was not even a republic at all, using Cicero's argument that it was an affair of the people. I don't know that I understood the nitty-gritty of how he plays that out, but that it basically it was no longer an affair of the people, and it wasn't a republic at all. That maybe Rome misunderstands itself and what it is.
Yeah, that's chapter 21. We are going to want to unpack that carefully because that's one of the most important foundational pieces in the book. But even before he gets to that,
It seems like here from 16 to 17 says, let them read to us the precepts against luxury and greed given to the Roman people by their gods. So his charge is not necessarily about the people, but it's actually about the moral ineptitude of their own gods that they follow, because they cannot even enact just laws or good laws or any law for that matter.
yeah, if only these gods had kept silent.
Right.
Right? So it's not so much that he's saying, no, it's your own immorality that brought you down. It's that he's saying you've never been as morally good as you claim to be. And that goes to the argument that you were never the kind of republic that even Cicero thought you were. So, but that doesn't mean he's saying that's what he's not interpreting God's providence here. That's where the pushing back on you a little bit here. He's not, I don't think he's necessarily doing that. But he's trying to show that their argument doesn't really make sense because it presupposes that Rome was ever good and then went into a period of decline, whereas he's saying it was always basically immoral. And if they would listen to Christianity and its precepts, it would be a lot better, right? In the bigger version, extended version, there's a great quote that I want to just read to you from, because he's quoting they, okay, the infamous they that we still like to quote, but they who Roman people, Roman pagans, want the Roman Empire to look like this. This is what they want their government to do. He says, what is of more concern to us that a man's wealth should be always increasing for the support of his daily pleasure, and that the stronger may thereby be able to subject weaker men to themselves. He says, let nothing unpleasant be required, let no impurity be forbidden. Let kings care not how good their subjects are, but how docile. Let provinces serve their kings, not as the rulers of their morals, but as the lords of their property and the procurers of their pleasures. And let them not honor them in sincerity, but fear them in worthlessness and servility. Let the laws take cognizance rather of the harm done by a man to his neighbor's vineyard than of that which he does to his own life. Let no one be brought to judgment unless he harms another's property or house or health, or is troublesome or offensive to someone against his will. Otherwise, let everyone do as he wishes with what is his, either with his own cronies or with anyone else who is willing. And he kind of goes on along that line. He says, where anyone who wishes and is able may play, drink, vomit, and dissipate day and night. And if anyone disapproves of this happiness, let him be a public enemy. So what do they want their government to do based on that description? And when it comes to morality, what do most of the Roman people want their government to do?
Allow the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, it's putting an American spin on it, right? But essentially you could say nothing, right? Like, stay out of morality. So, he's kind of saying if that's really what the Romans want, and your gods are telling you to live this immoral lifestyle. What do you expect is going to happen? You're going to be a pretty immoral empire or city. And that leads to that really important chapter 21. Did anyone write any theses about the whole engagement with Cicero and the Republic? A thesis or a question?
Maybe I heard about the question related to Cicero.
Okay.
That's yeah, what was Cicero's definition of justice that Augustine refuted, and how might Augustine's critique apply to the plurality of concepts of justice in today's pluralistic society?
Okay, so his critique of, you said,
when I read this book, I think Augustine critiqued Caesar's justice, but I couldn't find Caesar's definition of justice in this book. So what is that? And then if that justice has the definition, it can be used and exist in today.
Okay, so yeah, so thank you. So do you all know who Cicero was? Did you read the footnote? Right, Cicero's a defender of the Roman Republic around the time that Julius Caesar comes along and takes over. And so Cicero is one of we might think of him as a conservative who's looking back to the older days when Rome was better and freer and well-governed and all that sort of thing, right? And so Cicero ends up arguing, though, that the Republic had perished long ago. And in order to make that argument, he has to define what a republic is. So part of what you're getting at is essential to his definition of a republic is that it has justice. Because if it didn't have justice, what would it be then?
It's not the republic, it's a true republic.
Right. So it would be a tyranny or something like that, presumably, right? Yeah, later on, a band of marauders or a band of thieves. Okay, so what's a republic then? Okay, so there's the short definition, the affair of a people, but that doesn't tell us a whole lot. What people's affair, however, he defines a people, as bottom of 19, he defines a people to be not every fellowship of a multitude, so not just any group of random people who happen to have some connection with each other, but, quote, a fellowship united through a consensus concerning right and a sharing of advantage. So again, here, Cicero is trying to hold up a bit loftier of a vision than a lot of other Roman folks have about what the political entity could be. And he calls it a republic. And what that is, so it's not just power, it's not just brute force, it's not all the sort of lower ways we could define politics, but it's some sort of fellowship. But there's also a shared understanding, a consensus. It doesn't necessarily have to be consensus about everything, but concerning right, which is another word for justice, and a sharing of advantage. So some common interest along with justice. So if it was, if it was just a business, it might have consensus about some common interest, but it wouldn't have consensus about justice necessarily. It wouldn't be concerned with that. He says that Cicero says a republic exists when a people therefore is governed well and justly. And it's not about the type of government, right? He says it could be a king, could be aristocrats, could be the whole people. Notice right there, you have a key tendency in political theory, the one, the few, and the many. You see this in Aristotle, you see in Plato, you see it lots of writers. That basically you can think of political structures as variations of that. You know, even in the United States today, we have one president, right? We have the few, which is kind of the US Senate, which is designed a smaller number, and then you have the many, which is the House of Representatives, designed to represent everybody. So what really matters, he's saying, is not the structure of the government, but it's more of like the moral culture, in a way, right, of the republic. So why is Augustine, or why does Cicero say that, well, it's more Augustine who says, right, that it was therefore no republic at all, ever. Why does Augustine say that?
What was your question, Maxine?
Why does Augustine say, beyond Cicero, Augustine says not just that the republic fell apart a long time ago. Augustine says it never actually existed.
Because it never really pursued true justice.
Right. That's on near bottom of 21. So he's doing kind of the same move there that he's doing with his contemporary Romans. He's saying, well, even back then it wasn't as good as Cicero made it out to be. Augustine seems to have like a kind of realism, right? Or maybe you would even say skepticism, cynicism even, about Roman politics. That might tempt you to say, well, Augustine is just typical Christian. He's probably just going to be a separatist, right? Who says Christians shouldn't be part of politics because politics is so immoral and so corrupt. Like you could see from this point, he could make that move, right? Like what a lot of early Christians actually did. But then he qualifies it. How does he qualify it at that point? He sort of makes two key points right towards the end of chapter 21. Right. In other words, so far, all we've talked about that Augustine has done is to criticize Rome. Rome today, Rome in Cicero's day, Rome before Cicero's day. It's all bad. It's all worse than it thinks it is, right? Sounds like a fundamentalist, pietist, maybe someone who wants to withdraw, right? But then he makes two key points that are going to set up the rest of the book, arguably.
I mean, what you're getting at is, here at the bottom of page 21, it says, nevertheless, true justice does not exist except in that republic whose founder and ruler is Christ. That there is a true republic, and that republic is only founded in the city of God, not the city of man.
Yeah, okay, so that's one point. That I'm not saying that it's impossible for there to be a true republic. But the only one is the one that Jesus founded. Now then he says, if we can admit that it's a republic, because why would we call the kingdom of God a republic? Does it fit the definition?
Because it's the people.
More than just a people. A people what, Curtis? Somebody else?
They have shared interests and true justice is happening under Christ.
Yeah, they have a common interest and they have a shared consensus about what is right. And I want to argue extensively throughout this book in big swaths that you didn't read, right? That's because Jesus can actually make his followers righteous. Can actually forgive our sins. He can actually give us the Holy Spirit. So we actually practice virtue and have genuine community with each other in a way that no pagan political society can ever attain. It can aspire for it, it can long for it, but it can't be it. So is Augustine mixing categories here, though? Should we criticize Augustine at this point for mixing religion and politics?
He's actually keeping them pretty separate in some way, right? Because he's saying that you desire true justice, but you will never achieve it, but actually it's only found in this one. So it's almost as if he's kind of separating the two in a way.
He's distinguishing them,
Yeah.
he's not conflating them. But I can imagine a lot of people today would be to have the opposite of fear, the opposite concern that he's bringing, as if one has anything to do with the other. But I think it's safe to say that in Augustine's view, right, Jesus is a historical figure. He's making a true community. The world will one day be that community. So there's no mixing of categories here. Politics and the gospel have a lot of overlapping concerns. You shouldn't conflate them. The reason you shouldn't conflate them is not because they don't have the same concerns, it's because what they could each possibly accomplish and how they operate is very, very different. So yeah, so that's one qualification, but you skipped over another one that's just as important for political theology. Because if that's all he's saying, he could still end up being a separatist and a pietist, right? He says, okay, Christians, let's withdraw now from Rome and pursue the true republic. And a lot of Christians, again, have done that and would criticize Augustine because he doesn't do that. What enables him not to do that? What's the other qualification he makes? Right before the one that Eric mentioned.
Said that it also did exist, but in an earlier form of Rome.
Well, okay, so first of all, according to more accepted definitions, however, a certain sort of republic did exist. And it was directed better by the earlier Romans and by the later ones. Okay, so if we make ourselves a little bit more modest about what we're claiming a republic is, a qualified definition, a sort of lesser republic, then we can admit that Rome was one, and maybe even is one. And we can even say that at times it was better than others. Cicero's not necessarily wrong to say it was once better. So here, Augustine is like introducing a gray area, right? An area for moderation. Just because one thing is not what it claims to be, and just because the other thing, the city of God, is the only thing that can ultimately achieve that for us, doesn't mean there isn't still a whole lot in between that is important and that matters to us, right? So Rome may not be able to give you perfect community, but it still is a political community. It still matters, and it could still be better or worse depending on what people do with it. That's going to clear the way then for Augustine to say, well, then maybe what? If it could be better or worse, what implication might that have for us as Christians?
Try to make it better.
Yeah, did you say that? Oh, yeah, try to make it better. It's not all or nothing. So we got to be modest, we got to be realistic, we got to have our heart in the right place. But nevertheless, he's leaving some space for there to still be a reason to be involved. Okay. Anything else about book 2? Did anyone have a thesis or a question or even something that you didn't write down that you'd want to ask or say about book 2? Okay, then book 4. Very little bit of that we looked at. And Eric already alluded to this. Right? What would a political community be if it was in no sense a republic? Well, he says, without justice, what are kingdoms but great robber bands? What are robber bands but small kingdoms? So when domination or exploitation or injustice is the purpose of the community, it really has no moral authority. It's just like a band of robbers. So that's kind of like the one extreme of what it could be. And that implies for Christians, then the question is, are you willing to just let it be that? Or do you want to try to help it be something better? Any theses or questions about book 4? So anything in the ranges of pages 30 through 35. You wrote page numbers.
Oh, I had one on.
Okay.
It's a matter of God's grace and providence that we may find some happiness in our nations here on earth. God gives happiness in part here on earth, but true happiness only rests in the eternal city which resides beyond this life. He gives both good and evil to some of us as rulers in order that we might not expect grants of either in terms of power, but rather that in these temporal things we experience signs of eternal good found only in God. Chapters 15 and 33, mostly page 35.
Yeah, so what do you make about that, make of that argument? What's he? How would you sum that up, what he's saying, and do you think he's right about that?
I think it's definitely convincing that rulers and even imperfect ruling systems such as Rome can provide, as we were saying, some comfort. We're all still in the gray area because there are things that Christians can do and influence. And he even says at one point, like, hopefully within these imperfect situations, Christians can be of great influence and like have the power. That would be ideal, even in the sinful part. So I think he's right in that. And I did think it was interesting that he talked about God's providence in using both good and evil rulers to influence even Christians to do further things for the kingdom of God.
And this is where he gets into the nature of virtue and where it comes from, right? He's starting to get into why the earthly city cannot provide it. Virtue is closely connected in ancient thought with happiness, right? Those who are virtuous are going to be those who are happy, at least in the long run. But only God is the author of happiness. That's where he concludes with in 33. And then he makes that claim: servants can have it or lack it, and kings can have it or lack it. But it shall be complete in that life where no one is a servant. Therefore, he gives earthly kingdoms to the good or the evil, so that his worshippers, who are still children as regards moral progress, may not desire these gifts from him as something great. And then he connects it to the Old Testament, ultimately pointing it. So in a weird way, right? Even pagan Rome can point forward to a much diminished sense from the Old Testament Israel, but they can both, insofar as they both involve aspirations that people have for virtue and happiness, but they can't satisfy them. They point them to something else that can. And whether or not you have that happiness does not depend on where you fit within the world's hierarchy. Now, when he says that, you might think, oh, is he saying therefore that justice doesn't matter? Being a servant or a king doesn't matter. No, he's saying one day there will be a world where no one's a servant. But nevertheless, in this world, when you still have kings and servants, those who look to God for happiness can attain that.
Can I ask a quick question? What does Augustine mean by happy? I feel like that word's doing a lot of heavy lifting here.
Yeah, what do you think he means? Do you
I get the word, the turn of phrase that comes to my mind is just human flourishing, or thinking like idyllically, like happiness is the evisceration of sin and the return of Christ.
Yeah, I don't know if it's been defined in what you read. And I'd have to look and find. I mean, he clearly has a much fuller understanding of true happiness than any sort of subjective understanding that would be right. So I don't think it's crucial to his point here to have sort of like a nailed down version of what happiness is, because he would say that the pagans themselves know that nobody's really attained it. And even Christians haven't fully attained it. So it would be hard to define exactly what it was. But there are other places where he talks about, in engaging with the pagan philosophers, what is necessary for it. Like, virtue is necessary, but it's not enough. You need community. But when you're living in this life and stuff can be taken away from you, right? It's hard to be happy. Aristotle says the same things. In fact, Aristotle famously says that nobody can really be happy until the end of their life, because earlier in their life, they could lose whatever they have, and knowing that they could lose it's gonna make them less happy. Which, then how could you ever be happy, right? Right. And I think there's a widespread sense of that, and Augustine knows that. So I don't think he's as concerned to nail down exactly what happiness is, as so much to recognize that everyone realizes it's what they're after. Everyone realizes it's fragile and fleeting. And it can only come from God and only in the age to come.
Or is true happiness and or fulfillment found in Christ? Easy.
Yeah, but I think in like a Pauline sense of like, we have a foretaste of it, like we have the hope of happiness. But we still don't have perfect happiness, I think Augustine would say. Yeah.
Can I just make a quick
Yeah.
comment on that? I think in the further chapters, especially in book 19, he tries to integrate virtue, peace, and the order of things as in creation with trying to attain that happiness. Like we have to adhere to these things in order to attain that kind of happiness. So
Right.
I don't think he actually gave a definition of happiness, but he tried to say what we can do to attain that.
Yeah, at least what are some essential components of it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so he keeps going with this in book 5. Book 5's pretty important because it's where he starts to work out the difference between Roman virtue and true virtue. And it turns out that Roman virtue isn't as worthless as you might have thought after just reading book 2. So any theses someone want to read about book 5? And so that's what pages?
40.
40 to 44.
Speak up in the back.
I had I guess more of a musing, I guess, on what he said on page 41. At the beginning of chapter 17, Augustine writes, concerning this life of mortals, which is lived and ended in a few days, what difference does it make whose governance a man who is about to die lives under, so long as those who rule do not compel him to impiety and sin? So just kind of the kind of wondering or question I have with that is, would this suggest that like armed rebellion or war in general is only justifiable when the party one is going to war against is promoting or mandating sin?
Because otherwise it doesn't matter sufficiently to justify it, you're saying. Yeah.
He kind of talks about that in book 4 at some point, right, where he says, he's kind of saying like conquest is not a good in of its own, right, or empire building is not actually this good thing necessarily. It would be better for small independent states to exist happily next to one another if that were possible, but in cases where that's not possible and you need to pursue justice, I think he kind of makes that caveat for earthly politics. Sometimes you need to do it in as a way of pursuing justice, but in love At the same time, I think he's critiquing the Roman love of victory and conquest, where he's saying, if you come to love conquest as an end of itself, you actually love the sin of the people that you're conquesting. You celebrate the fact that they're sinful enough that you had to go in and beat them up.
Yeah, so I mean, it definitely, a lot later in what we read too, he says a lot more about just war, right? Which suggests that you're onto something, I think, when it comes to his view of government. But it's kind of, I mean, there is this sort of realistic strain underlying everything that he does. I mean, he wants Christians to be concerned about the city, the earthly city, but he doesn't want them to be too concerned about the earthly city. And he really tries to keep both sides of those tensions. Like, Augustine would not be excited about the people who make Christianity all about the quest for social justice. He clearly wouldn't, right, like that, because he thinks that will simply fail. It doesn't mean he doesn't think justice is important, but that's dealing with things that by their very nature are fleeting and passing, rather than things that are lasting, that are going to endure. But this is actually in the context of a broader section where he's saying positive things about Roman virtue, right?
Mhm.
So what does he say? What differentiates what he calls Roman virtue from the kind of people that he's really critical of, that he thinks are really bad? Or maybe another way of getting at that question is, why is he willing to say that these Roman heroes, even though they're not Christians, had something he can call virtue? What did they do that he's calling virtue? Yeah.
Is this in top 41? They scorned their own private goods for the sake of common good, for the republic, for his treasury. They resisted avarice. Basically, they put themselves and the people first before themselves.
Yeah, they punish crime and vice. Their people honor them because of it, right? They've received their reward. So, and that's as opposed to who? Like who else might you point to as a different way of doing things among the pagans?
Leading things for themselves.
Yeah, people who are only out for themselves, who exploit other people, who want to dominate, right? It's sort of like saying, that, you'd rather have, pick your world leader. You'd rather have even a fallen world leader like Winston Churchill, let's say, who wasn't a Christian as far as I'm aware. But who wouldn't rather have Winston Churchill as your leader than Adolf Hitler? Right? Because Winston Churchill cared about the common good and, cared about principles of justice. Doesn't mean Winston Churchill's like Jesus or anything like that, right? But the difference that remains between the kind of virtue that someone like Winston Churchill had and an Adolf Hitler is still quite substantial and worthy of honor. But it's like Augustine can't say that without saying the other side, right? So then right there in chapter 16, he's saying, okay, well, it's still not what the people in the city of God have. The people of the city of God are never going to be content with such earthly virtue, earthly justice. But then chapter 19, very beginning of chapter 19, there is a great difference between the desire for human glory and the desire for domination. Next page says, those who desire true glory, even of human praise, will avoid displeasing those who think well of them. And then in the next paragraph, he who scorns glory and is avid for domination is worse than the beasts. Do you find this compelling?
Mhm.
Right, which when I think in First Timothy, right, Paul tells Christians to pray for governing authorities so that we could live peacefully and quietly, you know. So a good government, even if it's not perfect, still enables, it's still a blessing for the church. So we would want the better type of people ruling, right? Not the worst type of people, even if they're pagans. Does that mean we would want Christians in particular to be ruling? Yeah,
He says on 44 at the bottom of that top paragraph, nothing, however, could be more felicitous for human affairs than that those living well and endowed with true piety, if they have knowledge of the ruling peoples, might also by their mercy have the power. Is that not saying that they should in fact participate and it would be best for people?
yeah, I think you're both right. I mean, in the sense that, right, he does have this, you know, don't be too obsessed with it aspect. But you're right. I mean, that quote is exactly on target. He's saying, of course, we want more virtuous people to be ruling rather than less virtuous, but nothing's better than, therefore, Christians who presumably are more virtuous. But he doesn't actually just say nothing better would be for Christians to have power. He actually, it's a subset of Christians, right? What are the key characteristics of the subset that it would actually be happy to have in charge?
That they have true virtue.
Yeah, true virtue or true piety, which will go with virtue. Plus,
And-
though, even that wouldn't be enough. You could be the most virtuous person in the world. Doesn't mean I'd vote for you for president. If what? What else do they have to have?
Knowledge of ruling people.
Knowledge of people, political skill, political knowledge, wisdom. So this is not the, oh, I want to know who's running for office that are Christians so I can vote for them without knowing anything about them. That's not what he's saying here. But he is saying all things being equal, a Christian is going to have a better understanding and practice of virtue than a pagan. And so if that Christian also has political skill, that would be the ideal, right? What he's saying here is, if you can have a more wise, Christ-like person in charge, that would indeed be a good thing. Is he right about that? It's the very end of chapter 20 or chapter 19. It's the top of page 44.
He continues that thought in chapter 24 with that really long sentence that kind of finishes it off. But at the beginning, it says, we claim that if they are happy, I think he's talking about Christian emperors, if they are happy if they make their power the servant of God's majesty by using it for the greatest possible extension of his worship, if they fear and love and worship God, and if they love the kingdom in which they are not afraid to share power more than the earthly kingdom, and so on. He's talking, I think he's calling for piety, but also recognizing humility is essential for if you want to be a Christian politician, you have to know where you are. He says earlier that you can't forget that you're a human. And the emperors and earlier things, like when he references that in the footnotes, he references some lavish king, you know, they think they're gods, and that becomes a problem.
Right, so that they're characterized by humility, they're servant oriented, right? They love the kingdom of God more than their earthly kingdom, and they'd happily give it up, right, to enter into the kingdom of God. They show mercy, you know, like who does that remind you of? I mean, what's he describing there?
Christ.
Yeah, if they're Christ-like, that's what a Christian emperor is. And he refers kind of cryptically to certain Christian emperors, right? So even here, he's not willing to say that all the so-called Christian emperors were this, but he does think that certain Christian emperors aspired to this or embodied this to some degree or another, and he thinks that's a good thing.
Is he claiming that no Christian emperor could ever be happy though here? Because he's saying that like, or maybe I'm misunderstanding what he's trying to say here, that like no emperor is truly Christian because by ruling, they are like disqualifying themselves as Christian because even the demon worshippers that do not belong to the kingdom of God are emperors.
So I don't think goes back to what we said earlier about happiness. He's saying they're not happy because they were successful by earthly standards.
Okay.
They're happy insofar as they rule in a Christ-like way. That's what I take him to be saying. And so that's not perfect. They're not perfect. So they don't have perfect happiness. But they will approach happiness insofar as they are a faithful Christ-like emperor.
I think he's just making the comment that even, so these gifts or other comforts of this sorrowful life were even earned by demon worshippers. He's not saying that by virtue of being linked in the same office as these demon worshippers, then you're not actually acting as a Christian. I think he's just making the comment of those who were in this position, were demon worshippers. I think that he's just making that contrast.
So yeah, I see. So like the political success. So in other words, ruling a long time, leaving your sons in office, conquering your enemies, right? Pagan demon worshippers experience those things.
Right. So that's not a sign of true Christian leadership just because you have those.
Right. That's worldly success.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. It doesn't mean they're bad, but
Okay.
they're not uniquely Christian.
See, I thought Augustine was saying like, no, if you're experiencing this, then you're not a Christian leader.
Oh, I see. No, I don't think that'd be what he's saying. It's like he's got these gradations of gift, right? So there are gifts that Christians share in common with pagans, and these are some of them. But the very fact that we share them in common with pagans tells us that they're not the ultimate gifts. So I think this what you pointed out to here, Curtis, chapter 24 is a really, really pivotal key part of the city of God, because it's a nice glimpse into what Augustine thinks politics ought to be, if the right type of people are in power. I'm sure that we still have the whole dilemma of a lot of Christians still wrestle with that, right? Like, should Christians really try to do what Augustine's talking about here? The New Testament never says we should, right? And we talked about that a little bit last week. Augustine knows that. The New Testament never tells Christians to try to get power or what they should do once they get it. So he's going out on a little bit on a limb here, but his model is to say, you can do this, and it's good to do this if you are Christ-like. So you have to be able to translate everything the New Testament says about being Christ-like into the political office of emperor or any other political office. So a question I would submit to you all is, up to this point, and we don't have to spend too much time on this because there's more coming, but is this convincing, or is this a pipe dream?
I feel like he talks, so as the New Testament talks about God ordaining earthly authority. And I guess when I was reading some of this, I just get the sense that he kind of feels like if you're meant to have some kind of earthly authority, God will ordain it. Like, you don't actually have to go out and this isn't something you decide and you pursue and you're plotting for. It's just God will kind of put those people in position, and he puts the good and the bad in those positions so that it's not this thing that Christians are pining for all the time.
Right, Rome's not a democracy, you can't run for office, right? It's like I'm running for emperor next year if I can get enough people to sign this petition. Not how it works.
Audacious.
Although there is a point in one of those latter sections where he does suggest that if people can elect their own magistrates, that's a better thing. You remember that? We're jumping out of order here a little bit, but let me just point it out to you here. Where is it? 216. The dialogue. Augustine says to Evodius, is it not right to enact, okay, so he says this, if a people is moderate and serious and a most diligent guardian of the common utility, and if everyone in it thinks less of the private than of the public good, in other words, if you have a truly educated and virtuous populace, is it not right to enact a law permitting this people to choose for itself the magistrates through whom its affairs, that is, its republic, are to be administered? And then Evodius says, like any good student should to his teacher, absolutely right. Not really. But in other words, under ideal conditions, Augustine is some kind of a democratic Republican, right? However, those are, especially by ancient world standards, pretty high bar. An educated, virtuous populace. We have to always remind ourselves of that. How few people were educated, let alone virtuous back then. But then Augustine qualifies it, right? Well, now imagine that same people having become depraved little by little, so that it prefers the private to the public good, sells its votes, is corrupted by those who covet honors, and turns the regime over to shameful and villainous people. No political commentary, please. Is it not also right that if some good and most capable man is to be found, he might remove from the people the power to bestow honors and hand it over to a few good men or even one? And Evodius said that is also right. So this is a bit of a tangent, but that's just a key window into how the ancients thought. It's not that they denied that having a sort of democratic republic type thing was a good thing. It's just that they thought most people weren't capable of it. And it's more important to have a just government than a freely elected government. So we can, that's I think a topic we'll want to keep coming back to throughout this semester as we think about that. But I do think it's important to note it here. It's not like Augustine thought the Roman Empire was the ideal system of government by any stretch. Let's keep going to make sure we get to some key things. So just to draw your attention briefly, book 14. I mainly wanted you to see there the very concise definition of the two cities. He introduces them in chapter 4 and then really concisely summarizes them in chapter 28. A lot of times people get this wrong. They think Augustine's two cities is like the church and the state, like two different institutions. That is not what the two cities are. The two cities are basically, in Calvinist terms, the elect and the reprobate. And they overlap in this world in what he calls the earthly city. So he uses earthly city in two different ways. Sometimes by earthly city, he means all the people who aren't Christians, true Christians. And then other times, earthly city means this city that we live in common with people from both cities living together. But they're created by two loves, right? So in other words, the one has to have the Holy Spirit, because only the Holy Spirit can create that kind of love. The other one has love of himself, even to the point of contempt for God, whereas the heavenly has love of God, even to the point of contempt for self. And then so forth, he works that out. Book 19 is often seen as the most important political book of the City of God. It's where he starts to transition into some of the practical implications, especially from the standpoint of, so again, we've established, it's not that Christians are to pursue political office per se, but if people in the empire are becoming Christians, then some of them are going to be Christians, or they might inherit the positions or get appointed to them or whatnot. So the first one that he kind of talks about is in chapter 6 of book 19. It's kind of a famous section. And it's on you might call it the judge's agony. So any theses or questions on this one? Why does the judge experience agony? Or another way of saying it in Augustine's terms, why is he never really gonna be totally happy? Anybody write about this?
I have a thesis, but I can. A little bit I had is the city of man may have peace, but still there's suffering and not true peace as innocent fall victim to the ignorant in the pursuit of justice. So it's like even in that pursuit of justice, there's going to be people who suffer because of that pursuit of justice, which is done ignorantly.
And why is it done ignorantly?
We're not perfect, virtuous, thorough humans.
Even when we're trying to be?
Some of us still make the cut.
Well, yeah, nobody does, right? Like, cause he's talking about an honorable, virtuous judge. He's talking about someone who cares about nothing more than doing the right thing. And yet finds himself in miserable circumstances. And what are the types of things that he becomes complicit in?
I mean, at the bottom of 147, it says, though he is condemned and executed, the judge still does not know whether the person he tortured, in order that he might not mistakenly execute an innocent person, was innocent or not. He's in some way complicit in murdering somebody.
Perhaps.
Perhaps.
Yeah. That's a great question. And anybody want to hazard an answer? And another spin you could put on your question is, if he's not saying that, ought he to be saying that? Based on what he's saying, is it possible to be a virtuous judge? You shake your head.
So, I mean, sort of coming to a conclusion, reading from what he's saying, that it's only in the city of God, only Jesus will be the one true ruler. All of us, however much we can try with the presence of the Holy Spirit, even if you get to a point where someone has the power and the wisdom, the only good king, I think Augustine would say, would be in the city of God, which is Jesus.
But does that mean then you think a Christian ought not to try to be a judge?
Not, I mean, the pursuit is not wrong. The pursuit would not be wrong, but to have a good, the only good king would be.
Okay. Yeah.
If we're not to pursue it because it's not gonna be great, then we shouldn't pursue to do anything.
Right. So, but I mean, the question would be, are there certain occupations that you cannot do without inherently sinning? Right? Like you might say a Christian shouldn't be a hire for kill murderer. Even in a Christ-like way. Right.
I'm living for Jesus, killing one person at a time.
You know, as long as I do my job well, I'll do it for the glory of God. No, you can't do that, right? Is a judge like that? Is a judge complicit inherently in sin? Augustine's not saying that, right? Why not? He distinguishes, yeah.
I'm working on a thesis from this section. It's not totally formulated yet, but it seems as he finishes kind of the section on like the last paragraph on 148 of chapter 6, it sounds like what I'm reading in him is that the judge, regardless of how quality they are or not, is necessary to sacrifice their own happiness because they're going to be somewhat tormented by their decisions for the sake of the society, because you need piety in the society, and without a judge, there cannot be any piety. And so the judge has to sacrifice his own happiness so that others might experience happiness through the piety of the society.
You were rhyming there. Yeah, so that's one way to put it, I think. He puts it even more concisely at the top of 148, right? Will a judge who is wise sit in judgment or not? And then he says, certainly he will. Augustine does not think this is hard to rule on. For human society, which he considers it a crime to desert. That's a key short little claim there. It is a crime just to leave your neighbors in the lurch when it comes to justice and politics. It binds him and drags him to his duty. He's not running for office. He wouldn't have done it, but they want him to do this. He's called to do this, and he can't desert it. He doesn't consider these things crimes because he's not doing them intentionally. He's not trying to hurt anyone. He's trying to only punish those who have been shown to have committed a crime, let's say. Now, Augustine does appear to believe that certain types of torture are not wrong, right? There's a difference here between an ancient world and a modern world, though I wonder if we could understand this better by saying, like, even though we don't do torture today, we do put pressure on people. We'll tell people, if you testify, we'll reduce your sentence, right? Those are not qualitatively different from torture in the sense that you're trying to coerce someone into testifying and you can't fully trust their testimony. So I don't want, yeah, Curtis?
I was gonna say we do torture people, like the American government has tortured people in like the hunt for Osama with
Well, we're not
enhanced interrogation techniques.
Right. So yeah, okay, but you get my point. My point is I don't want us to get too hung up on the torture issue, which Augustine would probably not think was always necessarily wrong for a judge to do. The deeper point is that even in the best legal system, you're going to have to make judgment calls, and they're not always going to be right. Even in the best legal system, you're going to have to coerce people, and sometimes you're going to coerce the innocent to do things that they shouldn't do. You know, like if you're a police officer, there are times when you're probably going to, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Rule out who was guilty in a car accident, even though you got it wrong. Right? I mean, that's conceivable. Does that mean Christians shouldn't be police officers? No, it doesn't mean that. And so Augustine kind of distinguishes here between an evil, which is a tragedy, so to speak, and a sin, which means you're morally culpable. And he thinks this is a case of justices or judges are caught up in evil, but they're not sinning. They're not morally culpable. He says they're not guilty, right? He uses that phrase. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of an element in what he's saying there. I don't think he ever uses these two words right next to each other, but he sort of sees it as like a necessary evil almost. And I guess I'm just sort of questioning whether that is a valid category. It's like, I mean, you can still have it be, like, you can still allow for mistakes with evil consequences can still happen without saying that it's, I guess I wouldn't say inevitable that you must do these things, but
yeah. So the distinction between a necessary evil and a sin. Notice he's not saying a necessary sin. And I think that's important to keep in mind, but it is a necessary evil. It's sort of like when a professor has to give a student an F. Right?
You should just never go back.
Is that an evil? Is that an evil? Well, in a certain sense, it is. It's a tragedy. It's not a good thing, right? But it's necessary. I think that. But what do others think about it? I mean, does this trouble you? Is there?
I'm curious if the big issue comes down to, so the argument which Augustine is making is that a judge is caught up in the evil in the sense of you have two guys that both were said committed this murder. And, you know, through torture, you procured a confession from one and you condemned them to death, and now they're dead. And now the judge has to live with one of these, like, he could have been an innocent man. Now, could you make the argument that now it's actually the judge's fault that an innocent man is dead? And like, at least that's where, if I do get tripped up, that's where I get tripped up, because the judge is with the mechanism through which this innocent man was killed. Now, granted, he'll never know that until he comes to glory, but, so that, I wonder if that's maybe a potential trip up for people, because now the judge is no longer just in the system of evil, but he's actually a mechanism within that system, unbeknownst to him.
But of course, evil doesn't just consist of things that you do, they can also consist of things you don't do, right? So if a country is full of people and nobody's willing to be a judge because nobody wants to get their hands dirty, so to speak.
Right.
There would be great evil that would result from that too, though, for which we would be culpable. So
it's just what evil do you choose to act within, right?
yeah.
Interesting.
Well, Lexi, can you say what troubles you about the idea of a necessary evil, as long as we distinguish evil from sin?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's.
Professor, can I just chime in?
Yeah.
I wonder if somehow he brings a little light to this at the end of chapter 6 when he says, he talks about a wise judge. This great number and magnitude of evils he does not consider to be sins. For a wise judge does not do them because of a will to harm, but because of the necessity imposed by not knowing, I guess by whatever testimonies are given or by people, and also because of the necessity of judging imposed by human society. So would that be, I guess, according to the case law, is allowed by the legal system? I don't know. Is that how that can be interpreted? I don't know.
Would what be allowed?
Because of judging imposed by human society. I wonder if he's talking about the case laws or the laws in the legal system the judge is using based on what he's heard. I mean, is that some of the justification Augustine is given when we are talking about the judge and the evils of society and the sins? Like, okay, how can you be someone of integrity if you're in that role?
Yeah, so do I hear you saying, like, suppose you're a judge today and you might have to rule based on preceding case law that you disagree with, but it's the binding law of the land. Yeah, that would be a analogous example of something a judge would have to do. Right, which he's gonna come to later, right, in those other sections on the Sermon on the Mount, his attempt to kind of deal with that passage, right? Yeah, Weston.
I think part of what kind of bothers me about that category of necessary evil is I think we don't have a very accurate understanding of what is necessary. So even like, and this is a bit anachronistic to look at it this way, but like today we've realized that torture is not necessary in order to figure out who did a crime. So like, it's not obviously saying like, I'm not saying like Augustine says torture is good and reject me for that reason, but I'm saying like, there is reason to say that Augustine was mistaken on what is necessary. And we may be equally mistaken today about what is necessary to accomplish certain things. So then we're just doing unnecessary evil without knowing it.
Right. I think that's a fair point, but I don't think you could eliminate the category. Like you could say, well, we know better about torture. But that's just an obvious example to us because
Yeah.
it is to us. But there are many other things that we say are necessary evils that we all just kind of accept.
Yeah.
And maybe they won't always be necessary evils, but they are right now. Because we don't know how to do away with them.
It kind of feels like to me, he's not putting forward like, in order to do justice, you really should torture people. I know it feels bad.
Right.
but
Right.
It feels like he's writing within the system that he's operating in and saying, like, this is the methodology we have to pursue justice and I feel like to try to pick out this like kind of systematic argument from him without hearing his heart would be not doing justice with it. Like, I think what I hear him saying is like, what a great tragedy it is. And even in the pursuit of good, you have something horrible happen.
Yeah.
I kind of hear this like lament in that rather than, I don't know, just this intellectualized, like, you gotta do whatever you gotta do.
Right, like he's trying to make rules, yeah. I mean, you'll see the same thing when we read Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he's agonizing over the plot to kill Hitler. If any of you read that section, it's very reminiscent of this, like. Bonhoeffer knows he's involved in sort of necessary evils, but he feels like he'd be more guilty if he didn't do them. And that's kind of what you have to, like, this judge would feel like if he refused to be involved, that's what would really bother his conscience even more.
I mean, Augustine even says exactly your point. On 147, he says, what is much more intolerable? What must be lamented and washed if it were possible by fountains of tears is this. A judge on account of ignorance tortures and accuses an accused in order not to execute an innocent person mistakenly, yet it happens that the judge does execute through wretched ignorance one who is both innocent and tortured. So it is a lamentable thing. It should be something that should bring tears to our eyes. But yet it's a necessary that this judge would actually execute justice in the first place.
And it's not like the judge is saying, I just have to execute this innocent person. No, the judge doesn't think the person's innocent, but knows that they might be. That's the part of it, right? The judge believes the person is guilty, but knows they could be wrong. That's more the situation. It's not like, oh, we have to execute an innocent person.
I feel like he's just accepting of like the tragedy of the consequence of sin in the earthly city.
In
Like,
part, yeah. Yeah, I see a couple more, and then I want to keep going because there's other stuff we got to do. So Weston and then Tim.
I guess just kind of with that, guess I would. I'm not entirely convinced that the fact that we haven't come up with a better way to do something means that for us doing it the way we're doing it is necessary. I guess I don't necessarily have a good reason for questioning that principle, but I was not convinced that that's the case.
Okay, Tim?
I feel like he would agree, in this situation, Augustine would agree that like action taken that leads to an unfortunate consequence based off of like a misunderstanding or misinformation is a lesser evil than inaction because of a fear of acting acting on misinformation.
That
The inaction is the more evil side
right.
of the coin.
Yeah. That's a key part to making it make sense, because it's that you don't have the luxury of saying, well, we don't have to do this.
Right.
Yeah.
It's gonna make the reading of Bonhoeffer that much more intense in terms of how we analyze those actions of Christians that did nothing in the face of atrocity.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so we're not gonna be able to hit on everything that we would dearly love to, in terms of topics. So like the next section, he goes on a long thing about the nature of peace, right? And you know, how everybody desires peace at a certain level, there are different degrees of peace. So, you know, even a band of robbers wants its own peace, right? The Roman Empire, Hitler wanted his own type of peace, at least, you know, in the Berghof, where he was kind of home was. And so again, it's like, yeah, we should want as much peace as we can get in the earthly city, but we need to recognize that true peace is only in the city of God, right? So well, you start to get with Augustine, he'll talk the way about peace, justice, virtue, whatever it is. There's the truest and best version in the city of God, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to be seeking, you know, the best possible version, at least in the earthly city. Then he's got the little section on slavery, which I would just point out to you. It's pretty significant because whereas someone like Aristotle and the ancients would have argued that slavery is natural, Augustine does not think it's natural. He thinks it's the result of the fall and of sin. But nevertheless, that's another necessary evil for him in the sense that it could be punishment for a crime or something like that. That's chapter 15. What I wanted to focus you on, though, is chapter 16 and the way that bleeds into everything that follows. So remember when I talked about scripture and its teaching on politics, talk about how, you know, the New Testament doesn't give us any political instructions for those who have political power, but it does give instructions to people who have power. And those people primarily are heads of household, right? That's where Augustine goes in chapter 16. And I think this is very significant for us because insofar as we might be tempted to say, well, a Christian shouldn't be a soldier, a Christian shouldn't be a politician because they get their hands dirty. Well, are we going to say a Christian shouldn't be head of a household? For the New Testament writers, for Augustine, that's unthinkable. And yet that involves pretty much all the same moral quandaries and questions. So what struck you, any theses or questions about this chapter 16 and the head of the household, pages 156, 157? And notice here, head of household isn't just father of children, husband of a wife, but also master of slaves, right?
I have a question about this.
Yep.
In chapter 16, Augustine discusses the true fathers of their families, saying that such fathers must ensure all family members will responsible for worshiping and serving God. So if as Augustine argues, the family is the start point or foundation of the city, should the state's essential or important role also prioritize the spiritual responsibility that is preserving and promoting true religion, the state's core responsibility? That's my question.
Yeah, so I mean, he's viewing the family as a microcosm of society, right? And it's the model for society. He says it explicitly. 157, first full paragraph, hence because the human household ought to be the beginning or the building block of the city. Then later he says, the last sentence there, the father of the family should obtain the precepts by which he rules his household from the laws of the city, so that his household might be adapted to the peace of the city. So they inform each other. But right, I think pretty much all Christians would agree that like a head of a household should teach people the household true religion. And discipline them as necessary, like discipline your children. Augustine obviously extends that to slaves, and it would not have been controversial for him to do so. The idea here is you're not seeking to harm them, but it's for their profit, right? Discipline is for the profit of the one being disciplined. After all, he says, just as it is not kindness to help someone when it would cause him to lose a greater good, so it is not innocence to spare punishment and permit someone to fall more grievously into wickedness. This is not so far removed from that judge torture conversation, right? It would be sinful not to do this. So if that's the case for a household, Augustine would say, is saying here, how much more for the city? So you're a servant, you're a Christ-like servant, but it doesn't mean you're like passive pushover. You're still guiding, trying to do what's for the good. What do you make of this argument? especially when you know later what we won't probably have much time to talk about, but his defending of, he takes as a matter of course that it's right for Christian emperors to stop pagan idolatry, and he also defends their intervention in the Donatist campaign, right, or in the controversy, to force the Donatists into the true church. And remember, even he says, I didn't always think this, right? I used to think we shouldn't use any coercion, church matters. But then I saw that it actually made a difference. That if you combine teaching with an appropriate dose of fear, the fear can do just enough to jar them out of their habits of thought and way of life. It can get them in church, and then the education does the rest. You're not coercing their heart, but you're coercing some circumstances so that they'll start listening, and then they actually end up embracing the true faith, and it works. So it's loving, it's for their good, and it works. What argument could you possibly have against that? Yeah. It's not explicit, yeah. Yeah, what do you all think? Is that a logical jump?
I have a quick question, for the household, is he thinking of like just the family unit, or is he thinking of like the old school? Like when it was a household might have a bunch of workers who come under the house, and that's considered the household.
Yeah, slaves are part of it. It's probably not hired workers so much. They're kind of sometimes part of it, but yeah, it's more than just nuclear family.
Cause then I could see the jump to city is much more natural when there is kind of mandatory participation by slaves, or in, if the hired help was considered there too, but just the idea that if you are the emperor, you're the head of the house, and you could argue that ideally, but if the republic was a bunch of your slaves, because they're mandatorily a part of it, they don't really have an option because they're under your territory. You could make that jump up. But then you're saying your citizens are slaves, so not great.
Well, they'd probably say your citizens are your children.
That's better.
Yeah.
That's where.
And your slaves are your children.
And your slaves are also your children, right?
Yeah.
Mhm. I mean, I would probably say, back to what you were talking about, what can you levy against this is, well, that's good if it's a good Christ-like emperor, but what happens when they're an unjust emperor? And what happens when they're not Christ-like, right? So, and then this is probably what a lot of people make arguments, is saying that Augustine, even in the moment, he's probably thinking of like, yeah, a very Christ-like ruler can execute this decently well.
Yeah.
But yet, obviously, history tells us that there were not Christ-like rulers, and they abused it, right? And so then I would argue, I would say that that's probably the critique to levy against it.
But he knows that. I mean, he says that on page 235 again with that whole section on the Donatists, right? That, yeah, I mean, when people use persecution for bad purposes, when they do that, it's wrong.
Mhm.
I mean, it's sort of like saying, driving your car. I mean, some people drive their cars for bad purposes. That's wrong. Doesn't mean that nobody should ever drive their car.
Mhm.
Right? So the fact that this power is so often abused doesn't mean that it's not wrong when it's not being abused.
Mhm.
The one thing I would say, in response, I guess, too, is that I think Augustine would be like, well, the burden of proof is on those who say that there's somehow a difference between political society and the household.
Mhm.
And probably most of his contemporaries would agree with him about that. You read Plato, you read Aristotle, they don't make this sharp distinction between household and political communities. And that comes later, like with the whole modern public-private distinction, you start to get that. So I'm not primarily interested in like defending or shooting it down. I mean, I just want us to understand why this makes so much sense to people like Augustine. And maybe it's okay if it makes us a little bit uncomfortable and challenges our worldview a little bit. We'll be reading other people later who are more liberal than this, so don't worry about that. It also relates to other things he says, like Augustine doesn't bracket religion as being like a private matter, right? Nowhere in any of the reading is he just like, religion and politics should be separated. If anything, Augustine's going to say, so in the next section, which we don't really have time to discuss, but you know, he has some of his most eloquent moments. People love to quote Augustine when he says that, you know, like Christians don't have one language, they don't have one way of dressing, they're willing to live under any different set of laws or type of government. You know, we're an international community. We don't get hung up on those things. Those are the lesser things. But when it comes to the big things, like your right relationship with God, your eternal happiness, things like that, that's what we really care about. And so if a Christian is in political power, that would be all the more reason to make that part of his mission. You wouldn't privatize it because it's so important. You make it public because it's so important.
It really does, when I read Augustine and even think about this time period, right, of when Constantine coming to power, is really the question arises is what would you do differently? Right? And if a Christian were to look at you and say that I would allow pagan worship to happen, or I would allow for these things that Christians should look at and think that they're abominable, so you're allowing for them to happen, then are you no different than them? It seems as if Augustine is kind of making a logical argument, is, you know, as Christians are coming into power because they just happen to be, you know, Constantine became a Christian when he was an emperor, you know, he wasn't one before. And so what else was he supposed to do? You know, and then the emperor who banned pagan worship, right, is he actually just following through on what the Bible tells him to do? You know, and so if he were to allow that, what would we look at him like?
Right.
You know, and that's kind of what it seems, at least what it seems like when I read Augustine. It's like, well, let's kick this around a little bit.
Well, yeah, so like assuming we've accepted Augustine's view that Christians should be involved in politics, which some wouldn't. But if you accept that, then presumably it's because you believe that Christians in whatever area of life should try to make it more virtuous, right? Well, why would you try to make it more virtuous in the realm of peace and war, in the realm of, you know, property, slavery, all these different things? But then all of a sudden, when it came to the true foundation of virtue, then you would just let 1,000 flowers bloom. Like, this is the most important thing. It's the foundation of everything else. If you care about true virtue, you will promote true virtue in a just way in your society. He's not talking about coercing people to become Christians or anything like that. So there are forms of religious persecution that would develop later that Augustine would have opposed. But to say that the magistrate shouldn't be concerned about the spiritual welfare or the religious welfare of his people, Augustine would find that a bewildering claim, I think. And in part because of his experience. We're out of time to discuss more of these topics, which is really unfortunate. It's honestly, this class is way too short. But
So
I
keep us until 4:15 today.
not well, you're THM, so that's different. But feel free to email me if you have questions. Obviously, if you wrote theses or questions on other aspects, Lauren or I will be responding to those. But you can feel free to email me as well. And, you know, even if we don't talk about it in class, hopefully what we do talk about helps put the other sections in a better context. And you can go back to them and be thinking about them, things like just war, property, stuff like that. What I need to do now, though, before you all go, is set up next week. And, you know, the gap between Augustine and Aquinas is about 800 years, 850 years. So there's a little bit of bridging that needs to be done there. So I did post a handout for this. So Again, I have a couple extras, so did I already give those out? I didn't.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but it's also online, so, the, Rome fell 476, which is, I believe, exactly 50 years after the City of God was published. Now, the Roman Empire did not fall at that point, but the Roman Empire became the East Roman Empire. It was the western part that collapsed. The capital had already moved, and became Constantinople, which is the modern city of Istanbul. There, you continue to have Christian Roman emperors who continued to govern in the tradition of Constantine, and many of them tried to be the kind of emperor that we read that Augustine described. They believed that as emperors, it was their task to govern the church and the empire as a unified body and to Christianize Roman law where necessary. And all this came to culmination in when the Christian emperor Justinian, between the years 529 and 534, tried to compile all the Roman laws into what is known as the Corpus Juris Civilis. And this became this compilation of law, and it's basically Christian Roman law, becomes the foundation of the whole medieval science of law in the West for centuries. So if you read Calvin, he will regularly cite Justinian's code, Justinian's Roman law. And you just got to remember that this is actually a Christian Roman law. Now, this code of Justinian was not based on, it wasn't like they worked out a bunch of foundational legal principles and then built up a system from there. It was a compilation of laws. Many had been on the books for a long time. They're all being pulled together and put in one place. So it's not systematized in the way that later lawyers would wish that it was. But later lawyers will try to study it and see if they can glean implicit principles from it. That makes sense. So that's going on in the East, where the empire endures, and it will actually endure all the way into the 15th century, though it keeps getting weaker. But in the West of Europe, the empire completely collapsed and gave way to a number of Germanic kingdoms, which were all more or less Christianized or being Christianized. And all that really united them was this Christian faith, because they no longer had a common political authority over them. And the symbol of the common faith was their common loyalty to the Bishop of Rome, or the popes in Rome. The Catholic Church wasn't quite as hierarchical at that time, but nevertheless, it was widely viewed that the Pope was first among equal, and it was widely believed that the Pope was the best person to follow if you wanted to be Orthodox, because they usually got stuff right. Now, when the emperors from Constantinople continued to try to assert rule over the church, a pope known as Gelasius wrote a famous letter to one of the emperors in 494. And this letter becomes a foundational statement for the way the West will talk about the relationship between church and state for more than 1,000 years, really. He argued that only Jesus combines the roles of both priest and king. Now that Jesus has come, only Jesus combines priest and king in one person, and therefore it's inappropriate for the emperor to try to do so himself. And then he says this, and I've given you the quote. The first sentence is the first two sentences are the most famous. He says, "To there are, august emperor, by which this world is chiefly ruled, the sacred authority of the priesthood and the royal power. Of these, the responsibility of the priests is more weighty, insofar as they will answer for the kings of men themselves at the divine judgment. You know, most clement son, that though first of the human race in dignity, you submit devoutly to those who are preeminent in God's work, and inquire of them the causes of your salvation. So learning, as concerns the reception and due administration of the sacraments, to be subordinate in religious matters. You know, therefore, that you should depend upon their judgment in such questions, not attempt to bring them to your will. Even the masters of religion, conscious that divine providence has conferred the empire upon you, obey your laws as public discipline requires, lest they should seem to obstruct the judgment you pronounce, even in trivialities. And so you get this nice arrangement where political rulers are to submit to priests in religious matters, and priests are to submit to political rulers in matters of public discipline. And he goes on to talk about how Christ himself established the Pope as the first among priests, and so the emperor should respect the Pope and so forth. But this attempt to basically say there's two, remember when I talked about scripture and I was introducing Augustine, I talked about the distinction between the spiritual matters which pertain to the age to come and secular matters, which are matters of this passing age. And on top of that, we built Augustine's two cities, right? The people who are destined to live in the age to come, the people whose future is limited to this passing evil age, and then, we'll end up in judgment. Well, now you get another layer piled on top of that with Galatius of religious matters and the ecclesiastical authority, and public matters and the what we might call the secular authority or the royal authority. And so that, it's another layer of what has been called the doctrine of the two, which is a foundational piece of Western political theology, of Christian political theology, and really of just the Western way of thinking about religion and politics, even as secular as we are today. Now, I should have said this earlier when we were talking about Augustine too. All the people that we're going to be reading, always be remembering what Augustine wrote about stuff, because it's always a worthwhile thing, whoever we're reading, to ask yourself, what would Augustine have said about this and why? Okay, I just throw that out there for the moment. So in the West, you have all these now Christian kings of the different Germanic peoples, and they are struggling to determine what it means to be a Christian king. And they're doing so by trying to follow the writings and theology, if they know them, of Augustine and the church fathers. And the controlling principle, the controlling theme for these kings was that political rulers in a Christian community are fundamentally servants. They are ministers, so to speak. They don't dominate over people, they serve people. And their model of authority is Christ, the ultimate divine servant. So just as Jesus says, don't lord it over one another like the Gentiles do, but you are to serve one another. And Jesus, of course, is the ultimate divine servant that's prophesied by Isaiah. So that's what Christian rulers were to aspire to do. The best biblical models for this, apart from Jesus, would have been, who do you think would be number one?
David.
King David. I guess I put it in the handout, so it's kind of a spoiler, but King David for his humility, a man after God's own heart. King Solomon with all his wisdom. Israel in general would be a bit increasingly be viewed as a model, and you can see the logic to that, why they would have gone that route. Now, Christian political communities tended to blend Roman law, local variants of Germanic law, which went back to pagan days, as did Roman law, of course, and then also Christian teachings. And they would, these things would all influence each other, sometimes in a kind of ad hoc manner. But it was believed, at least as a matter of principle, that all of it was supposed to reflect something deeper, which they thought of as natural justice or natural law. Now, echoing Augustine, they believed that how natural justice or natural law is supposed to be applied needs to be interpreted in light of the circumstances of that human community, which includes what it would have been like at creation, what it would be like after the fall, what it would be like where people are experiencing God's redemption, and then what it would be like in a perfect community. Natural law will be worked out and applied differently in each of those circumstances. So, for instance, in creation, natural law called for the procreation and raising of children, the common possession of material goods, which means people would possess all goods in common, and then freedom and equality among all human beings. This is kind of like what natural law would look like in a world that never fell into sin. After the fall, however, and we kind of talked about this with Genesis 9 a little bit, you now need coercive political rule. You need actual civil laws to be established. You need the law of nations. And they now need to respect and protect things like private property and the authority of masters over slaves and slavery. They need to limit human freedom. They need to respect hierarchies to keep a sort of level of order. This is what natural law looks like in the fallen pagan world. And these are necessary evils, many of them, right? They wouldn't exist in a perfect world, but you can't get rid of them. You need some sort of authority. You need to protect people's basic life, property, and so forth. Now, in redeemed communities following Augustine, you could achieve a little bit more, hopefully, of natural justice and natural law. You could have political rulers who tried to govern according to God's will in some sense. But the reality was they still had to be focused on governing people in a fallen world, which means they still had to focus on protecting private property, protecting the privileges of the nobility or those in authority or slave owners and whatnot, and safeguarding human life. And for those who really wanted to live into a fuller, more virtuous understanding of natural law, the gospel would give them the power to do that. The church would teach them how to do that. And that leads to the fourth category, then perfect communities, which of course don't exist in this age, but groups of Christians might come together in like a monastery or something, where they try to separate from the world and become as close to being that perfect embodiment of natural law as was possible. So that was kind of the way they thought about natural law, but a lot of questions remained within this of how political and ecclesiastical authorities should relate to each other. And so one of the big themes of political theology through the Middle Ages is secular and ecclesiastical authorities fighting it out about where those lines should be drawn, who's over who, in what respect. We could spend a whole course on that, but we won't. The trend, though, in the first half of the Middle Ages was toward a sacred or sacerdotal understanding of kingship, in which kings more and more took on the role of their Israelite forebears and would rule over both church and state. And the church itself, therefore, was kind of diminished in its authority. And on top of that, many of the bishops and so forth actually became political officials because they would rule over their own territories. And so there was a sort of, if it's like a teeter-totter of ecclesiastical and spiritual power in the early Middle Ages, the secular one's higher. But during the 11th century, there's a big reaction that happens against that. There's a reform movement within the Roman Church, and it comes to control the papacy under Pope Gregory VII, and so it becomes known as the Gregorian Reformation, sometimes referred to as the Gregorian Revolution. The Gregorian movement sought to secure the independence of the church from secular powers. And they thought that meant really emphasizing the authority of the church over secular powers. So it kind of makes the whole move shift to the other tendency where now the church starts to make more and more lofty claims about its authority. It tries to get more power over Christendom so that it can make culture more Christian, Christianize the masses, things like that. It leads to a whole development of church law and a whole group of scholars known as canon lawyers who try to unpack this church law and apply it to more and more circumstances. And in some ways, the church was self-consciously imitating the Roman Empire and its ways of rule. But what it does is, in the Western European context of the Middle Ages, politics tended to be pretty personal. It wasn't very bureaucratic. It wasn't very legalistic. But the Catholic Church was now becoming very bureaucratic, very legalistic. It starts to take the forms of what we would recognize as like a modern state, but it's the church. And this whole system of canon law was synthesized in Gratian's Decretum in 1140. And so you can go read that and study how these church lawyers saw laws regulating the church's relation to society, and so forth. While this is happening, there is a rediscovery and translation of Arabic and Greek texts going on. That's spurring a whole new fascination with logic and science and things like that. And the universities are starting. So there's a much more sophisticated, systematic way of thinking about all of this stuff that's emerging at this time. And in 1260, Aristotle's Ethics and Politics get translated. And this is going to have a profound impact on Western political thought. And Thomas Aquinas is one of the brightest minds of the day. And this is happening, you know, you might think of it as like while he's in grad school, right? All this stuff's coming out. And he's like, I'm going to devote my life to like incorporating all this new secular knowledge into our way of thinking. And so he decides to write this huge Summa Theologica, sum of all theology, now influenced by Aristotle and reason and so forth. I gave you dates there, not sure exactly what year he was born, around 1225, lived to be till about 1274. He's a Dominican friar, lectured at the University of Paris, which is one of the leading universities of Europe for a long time. And, you know, when he read Aristotle, like other Europeans, they were very impressed with Aristotle, because Aristotle tried to explore how humans ought to live from the standpoint of reason. And Aristotle developed a rich virtue ethic that emphasized the importance of education, habit formation, and community. And then his Politics described how to organize a political community that would promote such a virtuous society. And in some ways, it raised the bar as to what people thought was possible for politics. Like, how could a pagan write this way and learn so much that's useful and helpful? That's kind of the way people thought about it. At the same time, they saw Aristotle's limits, right? He didn't have a personal God. He didn't know the gospel, certainly. He said nothing about important virtues like love or compassion. And so there was a sense that Aristotle shows you just how much can be accomplished with reason alone, even by pagans, and yet how far they fall short when it comes to the most important thing. But that means it's a worthwhile scholarly project, if Thomas Aquinas is looking for a dissertation topic, right, to try to synthesize these things, and that becomes his life work. And so you will note that the two authorities he cites most often are Augustine or Aristotle. Aristotle representing reason, Augustine representing the best theology of the church. Aquinas is going to discuss a range of moral and political topics, many of which we have looked at with Augustine or that you read about, such as law, justice, property, war, obedience to authority, church-state relations, and the nature of kingship. And in each case, in this scholarly era in which he's living, he's trying to work out a more systematic understanding than anybody had done at this point. Here's what we can learn from reason. Here's what we can learn from Christianity. Here's how we can articulate the principles on which our engagement with these things are based, right? It's not just ad hoc. It's not just relying on, oh, hopefully we have a king with good character. Now we're going to have a principled way of thinking about these things. And it's very impressive, and it was recognized as such at the time. It profoundly shaped Christendom and the Western tradition to this day. And it elevates Christians' understanding of what might be possible in politics. So maybe we can do better than just sort of like a modicum of respecting property rights, respecting life. You know, maybe we can try to make society a little bit better. Now, we've seen already Augustine wanted to do that too, but Aquinas is going to give a more systematic foundation for that task. And so political rulers for Aquinas are going to be called to govern in accord with reason, in a way that discourages vice and promotes virtue and leads the community to achieve a more meaningful common good. Any comments or questions about that before I say something extremely important about how to read Aquinas? Okay, so when you, that's Augustine. Their names are so close to each other, I might sometimes misspeak and use one or the other, so I hope you can pick it up if I do that. But when you read Aquinas, he writes with a very scholastic method. It's how scholars wrote in that day. It can be bewildering to us today. And so if you don't listen to what I'm saying now and you just start open to first page and start reading through, you're going to hate yourself. Okay? And you might hate me because you didn't remember that I told you not to do that. So with each, so you'll see I've given a host of page numbers. It looks like a ton of reading. It's not actually as much reading as it looks like because you're not reading everything. Okay. So, I'm just going to open to the first page. Those of you who have it with you could do the same, but if not, not a huge deal. But you'll see it's organized into questions. So question 90 is on the essence of law. And then each question is organized into articles. But the articles are actually the questions, which is kind of confusing. So the first article is, does law belong to reason? Okay, the connection between law and reason. And then he doesn't start by answering the question, really. He starts by giving you objections to the answer that he hasn't yet given you. Okay, so here there's objection 1, objection 2, objection 3. And then he gives you the answer. And it usually starts with, on the contrary. And usually he will do so by citing some authority from church tradition or from reason or whatever. And then he will give his explanation in defense of his answer when he says, I answer that. And then he gives the replies to the objections that he stated earlier. So when you are reading this, write this down so you don't forget it. When you are reading this, actually, I might post this on Canvas just in case, or have Lauren do it, just in case you forget about it. Start by reading the question. So you know what's the question he's trying to answer. Then skip the objections. I absolve you of reading the objections. Okay? Skip the objections. If that bothers you, you can come back and read them later on your own time. Read on the contrary, and then read I answer that. Then skip the replies to the objections and move on to the next question. You will get the heart of Aquinas's thought just by reading the question and his answers to the questions. Okay? If you were going to study this at a scholarly level, maybe write your major paper on some topic as a THM student, you'd want to read more than that. But for our purposes here, it's going to be sufficient. And that will greatly reduce the amount of pages. And it will distract you from all the little scholarly arguments that were going on at the time and help keep you focused on the main things. It's still going to be a little challenging because it's, 800 years old writing. But if you stick with it, give yourself the time to do it well. It's very rich, very insightful, and will challenge you in a lot of different ways. So, any questions about how to read plans? Okay.
Just to clarify, we don't have to read the replies to the objections or the objections.
Right.
Sweet.
Yeah, it knocks out a lot of words. Don't look so happy. All right, well, we just covered 850 years, so like 20 minutes.
Hooray.
Really fun.
Yeah, so we'll slow down after this. All right, I'll see you all next week. As always, feel free to reach out to me, email me with questions, or Lauren, obviously, especially if it's, include him always, so.
Expecting really good for my,
Governor, what's yours, right?
You wrote those.
Statement on why there's nothing in an 850-year period between these two, that's like.
Oh, there is, so I meant to hold this up. I highly recommend this if you care a lot about political theology. It's thick, it's big. When I was in seminary, I was interested in political theology. I did an independent study with Michael Horton where he made me read this whole thing cover to cover. That's another book. But it's Oliver O'Donovan put it together. It's just a reader of all the great writings of Christian political thought up until about 1700. But there's a lot of people in between Augustine and Aquinas and a lot of interesting stuff. But I mean, we have other stuff to read and cool.
Like Hitler. Right.
Like Hitler, yeah.
Yeah.
Sign from the chair.
Aaron, please.
But if you want to look at this, I mean, or if you wanted to talk to me, I could point you to, I mean, to me, like for my dissertation, I did a ton of reading on all the stuff from that period of like church-state relations. There's a lot of fascinating stuff there. They're a lot more sophisticated than we give them credit for. Um. You have people like Dante arguing that the world should be one big empire. Same guy who wrote the Inferno, so it's just, but it's a different time, so it's less relevant to us. Whereas Augustine and Aquinas, it's more theological. And I think has very enduring value. Yeah, so. Thanks. Those of you who are THM students, want to stay around a little bit. We'll take like a 5-minute break and then come back at 3:30. But I don't anticipating us having to meet that long today, so. I'm sure you don't want to read those.
Okay.
Did you just make that with AI?
No. I saw this like 10 years ago. And so it's always on my mind, so I'm like, I can't wait to read it.
Might consider be there, might be like at all.
Not personally done it, he's usually seen as being more like secular in the way he talks and things like that, so. I said, like, I have his reading people in this course who are less theological, obviously, but they tend to be more modern voices. So he'd be another good person. Did you study him at least?
Yeah, I was my other major.
Yeah.
That's why I took it. But
Right.
Prince was like my favorite thing we read.
Oh, yeah?
I totally like more than just dog, like he's
Yeah.
not Christian in his ethic at all.
Right.
But it's fascinating to read and probably very practical if you didn't care about the ethics of it.
Yeah.
But I wondered if
Well,
talk about it.
it's the hardest thing in this class to decide what was the reading one. Like even with Augustine, like you read what, like 50 pages out of a 1,000-page book. So you're just getting a little more like that's painful. But had you studied Augustine or Aquinas in your?
Augustine, not Aquinas really.
So this wasn't your first time in the city of God.
I mean, I haven't read the whole thing cover to cover, but we did read parts.
So,
That's good. And John Locke especially, when we get to that, we read a whole bunch of that, him and Hobbes and,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's all more modern.
Right. Well, I don't mean, because Locke obviously is gonna make a very good case for religious liberty. But you can't really appreciate what Locke's doing unless you fully appreciated Augustine's arguments. And if you fully appreciate Augustine's arguments, you'll realize that Locke's argument isn't as airtight as he might think it is either, like it's, so.
Look at the great person.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll see you around.
It's all my comments are like, it'll be a lot. But typically, the point of a lot of comments is to like, it's gotta be. Like, this is, but the people that, this is more. Yeah, so. Kind of remains to be seen whether or not we're using like, examples from others. Here's so and so, like.
Yeah.
And Nathan, are you okay with us using yours as a good example? Or, and Nathan, are you okay with us using yours as a bad example? Yeah. And it's just like, well, if it's not, that's a big difference. So.
Let's fix this one and let's celebrate this one. Yeah, that's a good method.
Right, and so it's just like, well,
You guys have planned for Sarah's birthday?
Otherwise, like, even if it was just.
You guys doing anything for Sarah's birthday?
Being very busy.
3 examples.
busy?
I think we're gonna try to celebrate it more on Friday.
Week 1.
Yeah.
And
Because I have to teach Thursday.
And reference.
I'll be here most of the day, and then we all have stuff like soccer, hockey,
It's not
everything.
even back now, the thesis was like, yeah, it's not football. It's like I don't have my skin back, so I just yeah, just a few.
I'll try to bring a break.
You guys got it. Each week, try that argument. So.
no, it's good. And usually what I'll try to do is I'll try to like, you just what you have, and if it's like not quite there, or if it's like on its way. Or whatever, I'll be like, okay, well, consider like the option that's like based off of what you. Like, I'll try to do that.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Yeah.
That's perfect. I get it. First,
Peace.
we're gonna try.
Yeah.
How to get it out of the crime chamber. City.
I promise I won't ask to hold it, but I do want to see him.
You'll probably, strategically show him to. Our friends,
Yes,
and then hide him.
that's totally fine.
All right, so real quick, something I forgot to say last week is another day on which we have a unique thing as THMs that we should plan for is, so November 18 is the day that you're supposed to submit your one-page paper proposal. So I should have said this earlier, but have that ready before class. And then when we finish with the other part of class in the THM hour, we will go together through everyone's paper proposals. Okay. And we'll spend like 10 minutes on each one. Might have to be slightly less than 10 minutes, but at least give some feedback to each other's paper proposals. Yeah.
So we can't go to the Christopher Watkin event then,
Is that November 18th? Is that, what time is that?
3:30,
Yeah, they put it right in the middle of my class.
told them that, and
Yeah, so.
Yeah.
I guess you can't, cause I mean, you'd have to miss that anyway. The earlier part of the class, right? That's gonna be recorded, I assume, as well.
I don't think so. But
Yeah.
all I was told is that profs are expected to adjust, but I was like, ugh.
Yeah,
I
I
know when this
I
is.
can't like cancel a 12th of the semester.
I know. I was trying to tell them to schedule some other time, but they won't listen.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. Well, whatever. So yeah, so let's plan on that because that will help our papers be better. Students always appreciate that. And I forgot to build that in because most of the students aren't writing a research paper. So in terms of today, again, we don't have to hang out that long, but if any of you have anything you wanted to return to or talk about further, now we could do that in a little more detail.
I have a question. For next week's readings, we have page numbers on the syllabus, but I have Kindle version. And the Kindle version doesn't give me page numbers, it gives me location. So you will see in my first paper, which I handed up, I couldn't give the page numbers, but I gave the location because some books, when they are presented for, I guess, conversion to ebooks, when they come over, they just have the page numbers differ depending on the what you're using to read.
Yeah, so there's a few others in the same situation. What I'd say is email Lauren.
Okay.
And Lauren will tell you what I'm telling students about this.
Okay.
Does that sound good? Based on that other email.
I will say what you will say.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
you know what I'm looking for, so you can help her think that through. Now, do you have at least the table of contents so you can see what pages correspond?
Yes,
Okay.
of course. Yes,
Good.
yes, we do. I do have that. And all the books have that, but it's just this location thing. And I had to research what this location meant because it was driving me crazy.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't understand why with scholarly books, Kindle can't just tell you what the actual page numbers are.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Also, with all books, the no page counts go up.
Yeah, but they could still say, have the little page numbers in for like in the published version, this is when the page numbers.
But there's like 80 different public versions.
You just do want to
Do you think Uncle Amazon cares about that?
But
especially if it's a scholarly work.
Mhm.
well, that's the weird part. Just like you have the whatever version of Thomas Aquinas Summa Theologica and the other whatever version.
Yeah. Now with the Summa though, ordinarily you wouldn't cite it with page numbers anyway. You would just cite it with like a system that's unique to the Summa. So like what question, what article. So that's probably the best way for Thomas to do that.
Okay.
We'll still be able to find it because we won't need the page numbers. We'll just look it up based on question and article.
Okay.
I have one
Yeah.
question about book 19, chapter 13. Augustine states that the peace he speaks of is the tranquility of order, and that the peace of the secular world is not true peace because it is only a temporary tranquility.
Yeah.
Is there any possibility from the perspective of common grace that this of the secular world could be understood as a shadow or precursor of true peace?
Yeah, that's a great question. Based on what we've talked about and read, what do others, how would you answer that?
Or do you have any ideas?
And the peace of the earthly city, the precursor or point toward
A true,
the peace of the city of God.
And
Sorry, what chapter did he read from in book 19?
He was quoting from book 19, chapter 13.
Yeah, I think so, because I think one thing that we didn't necessarily talk about was the, I don't know the specifics, because I haven't read all of City of God. But it's very similar to Plato's Republic. In the sense, like a lot of the same points are there, and so especially this one. That kind of ties together like the order of the human person, like body and soul, like the unity. Like just as like the family is kind of a microcosm of the city, like the human person is also like a microcosm of the city. And so like there are different parts of the human body and different parts of the human like the human person. And they are ordered in such a way that like in order for there to be health of the human person, all these different parts need to work together in harmony. And so it's a kind of same sort of idea that I think Augustine is taking from Plato, but in a very Christianized way. If that answers your question.
I like some of what you said. I can't, who just responded?
That was Lauren.
Lauren, okay, yes, Lauren, because it says it talks about ordering of the peace of the city's ordered, and ordered, concord, concerning commanding and obeying. So just as the body is made up of different parts and has its own function, the peace of the household and the city has its own functions, made up of different beings. And I guess it talks about the order, and that points to some of the later chapters in book 19, I think 15 and 16, where again Augustine speaks about the ordering of things, as points back to creation from Genesis, when God created things, and in the food chain, in the line of events. So,
Yeah. I'm trying to find good quotes here, but I think even the whole way he engages the Cicero's Republic question implies that the one points to the other, if only because it falls far short of it. And he does, so like in book 4, chapter 33, I'm reading a different edition here. He says, "This is the mystery of the Old Testament in which the new was hidden, that in the former, the gifts promised were earthly blessings, but even then, spiritual men understood, although they did not declare plainly, both the eternality which was signified by those temporal things and the gifts of God in which true felicity is to be found." So that's talking about Israel, obviously, the Old Testament, which is a little bit different. But then in the next one, book 34, he says, "Earthly goods then rest in the power of the one God himself, and not in that of the many false gods whom the Romans formerly believed worthy of worship." So there are times where he'll make comments from Israel, but then he'll reflect on their implications for Rome too, like. Insofar as Rome is also concerned with earthly goods, and earthly goods are designed to point everyone toward heavenly goods, it's also gonna be, in that sense, a shadow. Even if it's even if it's only by its failure.
Thanks.
That's how I read it. But I think there's another spot where he does it even more clearly, but I can't find it right now.
I wonder if his point about virtue inherently means our gifts. He says in chapter 20, now, since it is not a goddess, but a gift of God, and he's speaking about virtue there. I wonder if we can interpret that as different gifts. If we are given different gifts, and we have to work together with those gifts, in harmony, and sometimes it takes time for us to recognize what gifts we have to be a part of that harmonious life or city or.
Yeah, now, the virtues, though, I think he would say God gives to all Christians, though not all at once necessarily. But in that sense, they're not like gifts. Gifts of the Spirit are different than fruit of the Spirit, right? And the virtue is more like fruit of the Spirit. So I don't know if that is what you were getting at there.
Not necessarily the fruit of the Spirit, the food, looking at what we bring to the table. And sometimes it takes time to recognize that when you want to live harmoniously as a part of a bigger whole. You may not know that, and that gift may differ depending on what group you belong to or what city in the state.
Yeah.
And that's what I was able to.
Well, I remember that quote about, it will be most happy if Christians that have true piety and political knowledge, if they were the ones ruling. I would say, Augustine would probably say, well, all Christians have true piety, but not all Christians have political knowledge. So political knowledge would be a good example of something that you may or may not have been given, and that may or may not enable you to serve in a unique way. Did you all find Augustine fairly straightforward when it came to things like self-defense and war, neither of which we really talked about a whole lot?
Yeah, I have a question. I tried to get Augustine's argument why these days. So since the 20th century, reports of prophecy and charismatic revelation have increased. If charismatic revelation comes into conflict with the human law, should Augustine's claim that God's law is supreme lead us to obey divine law even at the cost of disobeying?
And what section were you connecting that to?
It's the page number is 215 through 270. Yes, that chapter is the law and
Would that be in the chapter on war?
Law and self-defense.
yeah.
So you said 215, 216?
Yeah. 270 through. Yeah, the reason why I question about this, I think Augustine accept the secular word and their law, but it's the God's law is more superior.
Yeah.
Yeah. But these days, some people said like, oh, God told me about blah blah blah, blah. And then it's like not in human law, like it's sometimes it's illegal. But in this way, how can we deal with this problem?
So you notice there, yeah, on 214, he said, it seems to me that an unjust law is not a law. So as you'll see next week, Aquinas quotes that, he talks about that. Martin Luther King Jr. quotes that in a letter from a Birmingham jail. And then he goes on, to talk about how the law might allow certain wrongdoing. That doesn't mean it mandates it. And that doesn't mean that that's morally justified. Right? So in the case that he gives, killing somebody in self-defense, the law allows you to do that. The law does not require you to do it, however, and God has his own thoughts on the matter. So just because the law allows it doesn't mean Christians don't still have to think about, should I do this or not? So that's one thing. But then Augustine's also clear, though I don't recall in this section exactly, that, right, but remember where he says we don't really care what the laws are so much as long as they don't command us to act wickedly or impiously. But if they do, we can't obey them. But that still leaves a huge middle area where the government could require us to do all manner of things we don't like. But as long as it's not impious or unjust, we still have to do it. That's kind of where I see Augustine falling out on that. And then he goes on to talk about, again, Aquinas will pick up on a lot of this, but the human law can't punish all sin for various reasons. And so there are some things that only God can deal with. Augustine says that there are some sins that only wisdom can set us free from. So there's always, even if Christians were in charge, they would still have to wrestle with this. And of course, Aquinas is going to try to give principles for what types of things you should try to ban and what types of things you should try to require. And he's going to do it in a much more systematic way than Augustine. But Augustine hints at a lot of the principles that he's later going to try to work out. In some ways, we're returning to a time that's more similar to Augustine. Because he's writing at a time where he's really in a mixed world where many people are Christians, but not everybody is. And then for so many centuries after that, everybody claimed to be Christian. Like Aquinas is writing in a time when everyone claims to be Christian pretty much. But now we're in a time where it's kind of mixed again. I'm talking about in America, obviously. In India or Korea, it's never been majority Christian, but so that makes a huge difference.
Do you think Aquinas would, so I'm just thinking about like our conversation earlier about, for Christians being in office. Would Aquinas say that?
Aquinas or Augustine?
Sorry, Augustine,
yeah, I know it's easy to do.
My brain is not functional. Would Augustine argue, or like, I don't know, what do you think his response would be to like, would it be better for a Christian to be in office? I don't know, I'm thinking Christians in office being a good witness versus not being a good witness. Would Augustine say that if you're going to claim to be a Christian, but hold public office, and in that process kind of trash the name of Christ or the reputation of Christians, should you be in office at all? Because there's a lot of people, and I'm not going to name names unless you want me to, that claim to be Christians, and yet their actions, morals, etc., paint the Christian faith and the body of Christ as a whole in a terrible light. So do you think Augustine would say, if you're going to do that, don't be in leadership? Or still say, that person could still accomplish something good? Where would he land on that?
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to answer that in a way that's not anachronistic, from Augustine's perspective, how to think about that. Because I don't think he would think about people deciding whether or not to be in power.
Okay.
it's not like. But he clearly knows that there are emperors who are not good. They claim to be Christian, but they weren't good. He talks at one point about when Theodosius murdered a bunch of people and then went and had to confess his sins to some priest. Prayed with him for that, but.
So the
So,
problem isn't deciding to have the power, it's what you do with that power. Then?
yeah, that's what I tend to think. It's, he would more. He wouldn't focus on like withdrawing from the office because that doesn't do you any good. He would focus on like get your behavior in order. That's my guess. I mean, that's obviously a hypothetical question.
I thought you had a direct line to Augustine.
Sorry. I don't know if others have thoughts on that. It's sort of like, imagine you're a Christian father and you're a very bad Christian father. I mean, does that mean you should like stop being a father when you can't? Right? So we're talking about a world in which there's way less mobility, like vocational mobility, than what we have.
Yeah, especially like in terms of political power, that's not something that you can just like give up or like get rid of. Just like you are that person that's responsible and like nobody else can take that position unless you like, die.
Yeah. And that makes it all the harder, all our questions like, oh, should a Christian do that? Should a Christian do that? I mean, he obviously does ask, will a wise man be willing to be a judge? But his answer very much is influenced by the fact that, well, how can you say no? Like, he just doesn't have the same, he doesn't imagine people going through life as individualists deciding whether they should do stuff or not. Like, the community puts obligations on you and you learn how to carry out those obligations faithfully. That's kind of the culture. And even in the New Testament, it's probably more like that than we tend to assume.
Because most people today are not really gonna make decisions with the collective in mind, it's just. I'll do it, it's good for me and maybe 5 other people.
Yeah.
So I wrote down a quote on 157, where Augustine says, because the human household ought to be the beginning or the building block of the city, and because every beginning is directed to some end of its own kind, and every part to the integrity of the whole whose part it is, the consequence is clearly that domestic peace is directed to civic peace. So I was also just thinking about like that, and I know we're not really supposed to automatically go to like contemporary culture or politics, if you will. But if we're thinking like individual, like making decisions on, in your own favor as an individual versus making decisions for the collective whole. Could we not also argue that like people's domestic like decisions now are very individualistic and affecting the civic piece of the whole? Like you look at how people are raising their kids these days and it's like,
Yeah.
You could turn this country into flat out frickin' anarchy. We're awful parents.
Well,
That's where my mind went. I'm sorry.
think back to the quote that I read to you at the beginning of class. Where he quotes the Romans as basically wanting that, where people are just left to be free to do whatever they want, as immoral as it might be.
Oh yeah, book 2, you thinking?
Yeah, chapter 20. It's in the full, it's not in that. Otherwise let everyone do as he wishes with what is his.
Yeah.
Either with his own cronies or with anyone else who is willing. Let no one be brought to judgment unless he harms another's property or house or health or is troublesome or offensive to someone against his will. It's essentially like, let people do what they want as long as they don't hurt others. But Augustine is clearly writing is like, this is not a good attitude. And Christianity is going to emphasize the obligation of love.
Yeah.
What's interesting though is when we get to the modern world, we're going to start seeing this come back, but this postulated as like a virtue. But what the Enlightenment will call the no harm principle.
As long as I'm not hurting anyone else by doing it, I can do it, it doesn't matter.
Right. And it's not just Augustine. I think many a pagan would read this quote in Augustine and agree with Augustine that that's a bad mindset. Because it's socially destructive.
Yeah.
But probably the Roman Empire fostered that to a certain extent because it wasn't a republic. Who cares if I'm not virtuous? How does that affect the Roman Empire, right? And it's weird because we live in a republic in America, so to speak, and yet so many people don't take their political responsibilities seriously. Basically, they don't think what they do matters, and they live their life as if it was an empire, right? I mean, do you think that's an exaggeration?
No. So that's when you get, the minute people believe that their actions don't matter, no matter the context. Yeah.
But all the best writers, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, they're all gonna believe that like the best life is a responsible life lived in community where you're making decisions and you're doing it collectively and like that's what people have always aspired to. And in some ways the founding father, I mean Hannah Arendt writes about this, that's what the founding fathers aspired to for America to be, at least for those who wanted it. But I do think in the Western world, we increasingly live in a time when people don't want that anymore. They'd rather actually have a government that will just do everything for them. And as long as it's doing everything for them, they don't want to be involved at all.
Yeah.
And so then that raises a question of a crisis of community. Like, do we have meaningful community in other ways? I mean, lots of sociologists are agonizing over that question, right? We have affinity groups, we have hobby groups, we have stuff like that, but do we have meaningful community? If you're not involved in your neighborhood or some civic or civil context and you're not part of a church, it's hard to know like what level of community you're involved in.
Your community is essentially reduced to your phone for most people.
Yeah, it's very true, yeah. And that's not the good life.
No.
So that makes it significant too, that for Augustine, like what we're longing for is a city. And city doesn't just mean a place with a whole bunch of buildings close together. City means a republic. And think about how that ties in with Genesis 1, God making us in his image, calling us to have dominion. There's the way the New Testament talks about us being in a kingdom, but as rulers, like heirs with Christ. I mean, there's something right about that. That we were called not just to be like animals. We were called not just to be slaves or servants. We were called to be rulers. All of us. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so again, I would remind you of the quote where Augustine does seem to agree that it would be ideal if people could elect their own magistrates. So he might agree that a more bottom-up, that where you have an educated, virtuous people, more bottom-up would indeed be better. I think I could see him agreeing with that. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Right. Yeah. Well, I think I hadn't even thought to read it that way. I might call that the cynical reading of Augustine. Uh, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. I'm just saying I hadn't thought about it. I mean, the thing is, people like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero talk about that kind of thing. And so I think Augustine is educated enough and in tune with that enough to know that that is indeed an ideal, that is in fact conceivably possible in certain limited circumstances. But I think he probably did think it was rare, especially for 5th century Roman Empire. But he might have thought that if you had a smaller city, smaller political community, it would be more possible. But like in history, you mean? Like when in history? Well, I mean, so it's in Plato and Aristotle. Like the ancient Greeks had democracy, but it wasn't everybody. Like it was only the free people, it wasn't the slaves. So even when Athens was at its most democratic, the purest of democracies, all the slaves were still slaves. You know, they couldn't participate. But I think in Greek culture, that was a real thing already then. But the thing is, it typically didn't last long. It typically failed. And so there's this cycle that people talk about is how like republics are great, but they never last long and they always end up giving rise to a dictatorship or a tyranny, you know. And that was really, I mean, there was a lot of truth to that when the founding fathers in America come along. They're like, how do we prevent that from happening here? You know, how do we stop George Washington from becoming the next Julius Caesar? So I would say it's something that political theorists always aspired to. They always, many of them saw it as ideal, but it was a serious problem, and it was something that you would almost never be able to actually have. Now, but that's like legal participation, right? That's like governing participation. But you also asked about more like strikes or protests or rebellion. And yeah, I don't have quotes readily at hand here, but I think obedience, maybe somebody else can think of one that we've talked about, but obedience to those in authority is a fundamental virtue that Augustine would not be okay with like a strike or a sort of dramatic protest. Like he would be okay with somebody protesting verbally and like a petition. But I have a hard time seeing that Augustine wouldn't see that as essentially like the essence of anarchy. Uh, well, it's interesting because that same section about like where he makes the sort of democratic sounding comment, he imagines that, you know, if the polity gets corrupted, then he says, is it not also right that if some good and most capable man is to be found, he might remove from the people the power to bestow honors and hand it over to a few good men or even one? I mean, it's hard to imagine that doesn't sound like a legal process. That sounds like an extra legal process. So clearly he thinks that sometimes, I mean, I don't know if it's fair to call that a revolution. That might be anachronistic, but it's clearly not the ordinary legal process. But I don't think Augustine would have any confidence in the masses to do that. I think he seems to think that if anything, some good and most capable man would do that. But again, this is a time when the vast majority of people are illiterate. And their morality probably wasn't much better than their level of education when it came to just like common life. I mean, think about how the Apostle Paul writes about the way people live outside the church. Do you want those kind of people to be the ones running your community? I don't think Augustine would think that was a positive thing at all. Now, but he might agree that like, hey, it would be wonderful if we could educate everybody. Like, if we can Christianize society, everyone could become educated. Maybe that would be possible. Maybe in like 1300 years, that will be possible. Like would Augustine have been shocked that that might happen in 1300 years? I don't know. Maybe like it's possible within his system, right? It's just that in the world in which he lived, it was probably inconceivable. No, well, I think that's putting it a false dichotomy on it. I think he wants capable, righteous people. But there's more or less righteous. And if you can't get capable, fully righteous people, then you get capable, sort of righteous people. And if you can't get sort of righteous people, I mean, you just keep going down. You get the most righteous, capable people that you can, but I don't know that he's ever. I don't recall anywhere where he answers that question, like what's more important, being righteous or being capable? Because I think probably in Augustine's mindset, those are inseparable. Like, even think like with Aristotle, virtue isn't just a moral thing, it's a skill. Like if you're not virtuous, you're not good at living well. So you couldn't be a capable ruler without being virtuous at some level. Yeah, although that one comment also did imply that just because Christians are more virtuous doesn't mean that they're more politically skillful, and so doesn't mean they would be the ones to put in power. I think that's probably fair to say. I'm just guessing based on that one comment that was quoted earlier. Like you wouldn't choose a 12-year-old pious Christian child to be ruling an empire over a capable pagan, you know.
I'd love to see the 12-year-old try.
Yeah.
England might.
England might, yeah.
They absolutely would.
It's happened, but then they have people who rule on their behalf.
Oh, that's true.
Well, all good questions, though. I mean, I think this is the right way to think about Augustine. Like what you have to do is you really have to ask yourself, I mean, do I really understand his theology? What's the heart of what he's trying to do here? And then, you know, what sort of ethos does that call us to? That still leaves plenty of room to argue with Augustine about how exactly he would work that out. It's, you know, and to find ways where we might work it out differently. So you could say, theologically, in terms of his political theology, Augustine's brilliant, but obviously we need to apply it in different ways to a 21st century context, right? You see what I'm saying? You can differentiate between his theology and the way he applies it. But I would just say, but whenever you're thinking about criticizing somebody from the ancient world, you really got to make sure you understand the context with which they're dealing and how different it is from ours. Yeah. I mean, when you read my book, my Calvin book, you'll see I try to very carefully understand Calvin, but then once I've done that, then I try to come up with some more ways of thinking about how it would play out today. But so it's not that I'm saying don't do that. It's just you have to really make sure you understand him in his own context first. Because otherwise you're probably not going to apply it in any meaningful way. And the other thing is when you understand the ancient writers really well, you realize that they're sharper than we think they are. They've anticipated more of our modern objections than we think they have. And their objections to our ways of doing things would be sharper than we probably assume. And so the better you understand them, the better you can anticipate how they might criticize us. And it makes for a much more fruitful dialogue in your own mind, right? Like you can start to question, like, oh, is it right that, for instance, we have a government that does nothing whatsoever to encourage religion? Like, is that a good thing? Is it good that we have a government that has insisted that youth be educated in a purely secular way? You know, like, there's good reasons to question that. I'm not saying there aren't good reasons to defend it, but the better you understand those older figures, the more likely that's going to be a fruitful dialogue. That would be my advice.
Chris,
Anything else?
if I may
Oh,
just say something really quickly here. When
Yeah.
I was reading, I struggled with that as well. I kept going back and forth in my mind. And one thing that came to me, I mean, was the patriarchal system. And families have changed. What if the head of the family is the mom whose dad has passed away or they've separated? And like the language is not ours today.
Right.
And I had to keep getting myself back to the context in which this was written. What was their system? What was he speaking about? Because then I would be struggling with this, and I would keep wanting to put it in today's culture and in our scenario. You know, I would like transport it here, and it just wouldn't work.
And we'll have to keep doing that. And it'll be a good thing to do. Like, what political developments and social developments that happen later are actually better and what ones maybe aren't, you know, and how do we discern that? Which of them might Augustine, if he had seen them, thought, oh, that's great that you were able to do that? And which of them would Augustine be like shocked that how can you possibly have done that and call yourself Christians, you know? One other thing just to remind yourself though, with all the differences between us and Augustine, he is far closer to the New Testament world than we are, right? Like he's very close to the New Testament world. And so that's interesting too, because some of the things he just assumes as matter of course that really jar us are things that probably the New Testament writers also assumed as a matter of course, and should make us stop and think.
Yes, when he spoke about the wars and the Roman Empire taking people out of force, thinking that they are converting them for something that's better. I mean, when I read it, I interpreted as maybe that was okay because they were being changed for a good. But then he also went on and said, well, no, if they came to Christianity against their own will. And because I am from a background in where my people were converted to Christianity, and people who were converted, there is a whole big debate and argument like that, you know, concerning that. Like my people who've been converted, we see it as a positive, and we see this whole Roman Empire takeover as beneficial because we are Christians now. But you can't argue that in environments where people are not only Christians and they don't see that.
Yeah, what's your background?
So I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, and my 6 generations ago, my great grandparents went from India to work as indentured laborers. They were Hindus, they were converted to Christianity, and it's a whole.
Well, but even more so, like my ancestors are all Germanic, Dutch and Frisian and so forth. So they are the very barbarians that the Romans are conquering and converting in the centuries right after Augustine. So yeah, so why am I a Christian? I mean, I think Leah, you have Dutch background too. I don't know what yours is, Lauren, but I mean, for those of us who are from European backgrounds, that's how our peoples became Christian. It was the power of the Roman Empire and the Germanic kingdoms that were converted by the Roman Empire and then conquered others, and it happened through conquest.
Yeah, and there is a whole debate. I mean, Wow, we can go on and on about the rights
Yeah.
and wrongs of this.
Yeah, we're out of time, but
But
it is.
here we are. Here we
I
are.
appreciate it. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
We'll see you, Christine and Chris, next week.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.